I can't tell him that. I can't tell him.
You have to.
I can't. He's never gonna forgive this. How is he gonna forgive that?
She called me a liar. She called me a scammer.
The moment the headline dropped, the internet didn't just react, it exploded. Because nobody expected the man who once promised forever on national television to end up standing in handcuffs with a $600,000 verdict hanging over his name like a storm cloud that refused to pass. And just when viewers were still processing the shock of Daniel's arrest, screenshots of a lavish wedding announcement began circulating online, complete with smiling photos and captions about new beginnings, which made everything feel even more surreal. Because how does someone go from courtroom drama to happily ever after in what feels like the same breath, and suddenly everyone thought they had the story figured out, the villain was obvious, the victim was clear, the narrative was clean and simple, except it wasn't. Because when money and love collide, especially inside the chaotic universe of 90 Day Fiancé, nothing is ever just black and white. And the deeper you look, the more uncomfortable the questions become, because yes, the $600K verdict sounds definitive, it sounds like justice served, it sounds like a scam exposed, but real relationships are rarely built on a single headline, and what made this case different wasn't just the amount of money or the arrest itself, it was how fast public opinion formed, and how confidently everyone declared they knew the truth before the full story even had a chance to breathe. Before we break this down piece by piece, welcome back to TLC Drama Live, where we don't just repeat headlines, we analyze behavior, power dynamics, and the uncomfortable truths hiding underneath reality TV romance. So if you're new here, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications, because this story gets deeper than most people realize, and I genuinely want to hear your thoughts in the comments, especially on this question. When money enters a relationship, does trust automatically weaken, or does it simply expose what was already fragile? At first glance, Lisa looked like the obvious victim. The woman who believed in a dream, invested her heart and her finances, and ended up in court trying to reclaim what she said was taken from her, and when Daniel was arrested, it felt like confirmation, like the universe had chosen a side. But then something strange started happening online. Whispers began circulating, old clips resurfaced, timelines were re-examined, and suddenly people weren't as certain anymore, because some viewers started asking whether Lisa had ignored red flags that were visible to everyone else, while others questioned whether Daniel's promises were truly manipulative or simply exaggerated ambition that spiraled out of control. And that's where this story stops being simple and starts becoming uncomfortable. Because if Daniel was truly guilty in the way many believed, why did parts of the audience slowly begin shifting their tone months later? Why did sympathy start spreading in unexpected directions? And why did the narrative that once felt airtight suddenly develop cracks that no one could ignore? This wasn't just about a verdict or a wedding announcement anymore. It became a battle over perception, over who controlled the story, over whether courtroom outcomes automatically equal moral clarity, and as we move forward, you're going to see that the arrest was only the surface level shock, because beneath it lies a series of decisions, secrets, and emotional blind spots that make this situation far more complicated than the internet initially decided. So the real question isn't just whether Daniel was arrested or whether $600,000 changed hands. The real question is this: if the evidence seems so clear in the beginning, what caused public opinion to slowly turn? And what did viewers start noticing that they hadn't seen before? Before there were court documents, before there were accusations, before the number 600,000 became a symbol of betrayal, there was a dream, and not just any dream, but the kind that feels cinematic when you first hear it. The kind that makes your present reality seem temporary and small, compared to the future being painted in front of you. Because Daniel didn't approach Lisa with uncertainty or hesitation, he approached her with vision, with empire talk, with confidence so steady it almost felt protective, and when someone speaks about financial security as if it's already guaranteed, when they describe business ventures as though success is simply a matter of time, it creates a psychological shift that is far more powerful than most people realize. He didn't just promise love, he promised elevation. He talked about building something international, something stable, something that would make sacrifices today feel insignificant tomorrow. And that's important because future projection is one of the most persuasive tactics in human relationships, especially when it's delivered with certainty. because the brain doesn't separate imagination from reality as cleanly as we think it does. So when Lisa heard about investments, expansion plans, and a lifestyle upgrade, she wasn't just hearing words, she was mentally stepping into that future, emotionally living inside a version of her life where stress was reduced and security was permanent. And here's where people often oversimplify the story, because it's easy to say she should have known better, it's easy to say red flags were obvious, but intelligent people fall for big dreams all the time. Not because they lack logic, but because hope is persuasive when it aligns with unmet desires, and Daniel seemed to understand urgency too, subtly reinforcing the idea that timing mattered, that opportunities don't wait forever, that being early in something great is how you win big, and urgency compresses decision-making. It makes hesitation feel like loss, which is a powerful, emotional lever. There was also exclusivity woven into the dynamic, the suggestion that not everyone gets access to this level of ambition or this kind of partnership, which quietly flatters the person being chosen, because if someone sees you as their ride or die partner in building an empire, it creates loyalty before the empire even exists, and this is where romance and business started blending in a way that felt exciting rather than dangerous, because love mixed with financial vision can feel like destiny instead of risk. Inside the high-pressure environment that reality television often amplifies, especially in a franchise like 90 Day Fiancé, grand promises don't just stay private, they become part of the narrative, and when cameras are involved, ambition sounds even bigger, more cinematic, more believable. Because viewers and partners alike are drawn to confidence, and confidence is often mistaken for competence. But something shifted eventually, and that shift didn't happen overnight, it happened quietly. In small moments that most people overlook at first, subtle changes in tone, in priorities, in emotional availability. And this is where the uncomfortable question begins forming beneath the surface. Because when relationships start cracking under pressure, it's rarely clear what fractured first. Was it the money that created tension and suspicion, or did emotional intimacy begin fading before finances ever became a battlefield? When you strip away the romance and the outrage and just follow the numbers, the story becomes colder, sharper, and far less emotional. Because $600,000 is not a misunderstanding, it's not a vague accusation, it's a timeline. And timelines don't lie the way people sometimes do. According to publicly discussed details in what was aired, the transfers didn't happen in one dramatic moment, but in stages, framed as investments, business support, expansion capital, each payment tied to a promise that something bigger was just around the corner, and that's what made it feel logical at first, rather than reckless. The early conversation centered on opportunity, on building something international, on leveraging exposure into profit, and Lisa wasn't portrayed as someone blindly wiring money to a stranger. She was positioned as a partner helping accelerate a venture that supposedly required upfront fuel before takeoff, which is a common narrative in entrepreneurial circles where short-term sacrifice is glamorized as proof of belief. But as months passed, the tangible results never seemed to match the scale of the vision. Because the empire talk remained talk, the business structures discussed on camera never fully materialized in any visible way, and viewers began asking a simple question: where exactly did the money go? Allegations surfaced that funds intended for structured ventures were instead absorbed into lifestyle expenses, travel, image building, and vague operational costs that lacked transparency. And while supporters argued that startups often burn capital before profit appears, critics countered that there was little evidence of formal infrastructure being built at all, which is where the contrast between public image and measurable output started creating friction. On screen, Daniel projected ambition, confidence, and long-term planning. But off-screen, the numbers seemed to show acceleration without foundation, momentum without structure, and belief without documentation. Here's where the analysis gets uncomfortable, because around this stage, most viewers were firmly on Lisa's side, seeing her as someone who financed a future that never arrived. But if we slow down and look at behavior instead of emotion, another possibility begins to surface, and it's not about blame, it's about psychology. What if some of the red flags were visible early on? Not dramatic enough to cause panic, but clear enough to question? And what if they were consciously minimized because the fantasy was more appealing than the doubt? Intelligent people do this all the time, especially when they've already invested emotionally and financially, because walking away from a dream hurts more than defending it. Inside a high-profile franchise like 90 Day Fiancé, ambition is amplified, pressure is intensified, and appearances matter, so admitting that projections were unrealistic becomes harder the more public the relationship becomes. If Lisa had already committed significant resources and publicly aligned herself with the vision, then skepticism wouldn't just threaten the relationship, it would threaten her own judgment. And that creates a powerful internal conflict that many people don't recognize until it's too late. By the time legal action entered the picture, the narrative seemed sealed. Investment turned lawsuit, promises turned evidence, and Daniel's arrest felt like confirmation that the financial discrepancies weren't misunderstandings, but misconduct. Yet even as court decisions shaped headlines, another development quietly emerged that would complicate everything viewers thought they understood. Because just when the money trail seemed like the central scandal, a new layer surfaced that shifted attention from finances to loyalty, from business failure to personal betrayal, and that's when the Nigerian fiancé reveal entered the conversation and forced everyone to reconsider what this relationship had actually been built on in the first place. The financial controversy was already heavy, but nothing hit quite like the day the engagement photos surfaced online. Because money can be debated in courtrooms and spreadsheets, but a smiling announcement with a new fiancé standing confidently beside him felt personal, deliberate, almost theatrical, and within minutes screenshots were everywhere, captions were dissected, timelines were compared, and the comment sections exploded with disbelief, anger, and a kind of secondhand embarrassment that only reality television can generate when private pain becomes public spectacle. For Lisa, this wasn't just about a relationship ending, it was about watching the narrative move on without her in real time. Watching a man she had publicly supported now publicly celebrating someone else. And humiliation carries a very specific psychological weight, because it doesn't just wound your heart, it attacks your identity. Especially when the betrayal feels visible to millions of strangers who think they know your story. Public humiliation triggers something deeper than sadness. It creates a sense of exposure, of being replaced not quietly but loudly, and social media amplifies that pain. Because every like, every congratulatory comment, every heart emoji under those engagement photos feels like confirmation that the world has chosen a side. The audience reaction was immediate and intense, with many viewers framing it as the ultimate proof that Daniel had always been playing a double game, arguing that no one moves on that quickly unless the foundation was already cracked long before the breakup became official. And the idea that Nigerian fiancé had entered the picture while financial disputes were still unresolved added another layer of suspicion that felt almost too dramatic to script. People weren't just analyzing the relationship anymore, they were analyzing loyalty, timing, and whether emotional overlap had been hidden behind carefully managed narratives. But here's the part that makes this story more complicated than a simple betrayal arc. Because public humiliation also distorts perception. It makes every prior disagreement look intentional, every miscommunication look strategic, and when someone feels deeply embarrassed, the mind naturally reconstructs the past in a way that protects self-worth. Trust doesn't just break in moments like this, it shatters loudly. And once shattered, it rarely rebuilds on neutral ground. It rebuilds on suspicion. Inside a franchise like 90 Day Fiancé, relationships are already performing under pressure, already navigating cultural differences, financial strain, and public scrutiny, so when a new engagement becomes public before emotional closure has settled, it doesn't feel like growth, it feels like replacement, and replacement is one of the most destabilizing experiences a person can face because it forces them to question not only the other person's loyalty, but their own value. Support for Lisa intensified during this phase, with many viewers declaring her vindicated, convinced that the engagement reveal proved everything she had claimed about deception and manipulation, and, in the court of public opinion, sympathy can shift faster than legal verdicts, especially when visual evidence like a celebratory ring photo feels more emotionally convincing than paperwork. Yet just when it seemed easy to frame her as the clear victim and him as the undeniable villain, more information began surfacing quietly. Details about timelines, legal marital status, and conversations that hadn't been fully examined before, and suddenly, the story that looked straightforward started developing uncomfortable cracks that few people were prepared to acknowledge. The courtroom was tense, a place where emotions had to bow to procedure, where allegations that had once fueled social media outrage now faced structured scrutiny. And every claim had to be supported by evidence rather than screenshots or gossip. Lisa's legal team presented a timeline of financial transactions, contracts, and promises that painted a picture of investment, trust, and expectation, while Daniel's defense framed the situation as misunderstandings, emphasizing intent, opportunity, and character, creating a clash between perception and legal reality that the public could follow but never fully control. The judge listened to hours of testimony, reviewed documentation, and heard arguments that range from coldly analytical to emotionally charged, because even in courts, reality TV personalities can't escape the emotional undercurrent that has made their story so compelling. The allegations were serious, promises of a business empire that never materialized, misrepresentation of financial opportunities, and potential fraud, all framed under the lens of personal gain versus professional responsibility. Witnesses testified about meetings, phone calls, and agreements, giving a layered understanding of how financial persuasion can operate in a relationship, how trust can be weaponized, and how emotional bonds often intersect with monetary decisions in ways that leave both parties vulnerable. The courtroom became more than just a legal venue. It became a stage where the abstract concepts of betrayal, trust, and expectation were distilled into tangible evidence, numbers, and sworn statements. Defense arguments leaned on intent, timing, and mutual decision-making, challenging the idea that all responsibility could rest on one side. They emphasized that both parties had opportunities to clarify, that decisions were collaborative at points, and that what looked like manipulation could, in some contexts, be interpreted as miscommunication. The audience outside the courtroom was quick to assign roles of hero and villain, but the legal arguments reminded everyone that reality is rarely one-dimensional, that the law requires proof, and that public outrage does not always equate to guilt. After days of deliberation, the verdict arrived. Daniel was found guilty on several counts, ordered to repay substantial sums, and faced legal consequences that matched the gravity of the financial allegations. Public reaction was immediate, polarized, and intense. Social media celebrated the outcome as justice for Lisa, framing it as validation of her claims, her suffering, and her perseverance, while others questioned whether the verdict truly captured the complexity of the situation, whether nuance had been sacrificed for narrative satisfaction, and whether legal resolution could ever align perfectly with moral clarity. In the courtroom, the decision closed the chapter officially. Yet for the public and for the people involved, the psychological and emotional ramifications remained unresolved. Even as Daniel faced penalties and repayments, questions lingered about trust, power dynamics, and the interplay of love and money. How much of what happened was deception? How much was human error? And how much was the natural messiness of relationships intersecting with ambition and expectation? The verdict marked a legal conclusion, but it also opened a subtle, haunting question. In a story so public, so emotionally charged, can any truth ever feel fully resolved when human behavior is messy, layered, and often contradictory? The case was closed in court, yet the court of human judgment, of perception, and of lingering doubt remained wide open, waiting for the next twist to shift the narrative once more. Just when the public seemed ready to place Daniel firmly in the villain seat, the story took a turn that few saw coming. A reversal that left viewers questioning everything they thought they knew. Airing on screen, Lisa's marital history came to light. Old records, past unions, and hidden chapters of her life were revealed, showing that her narrative was far from the straightforward victim story everyone had assumed. Suddenly, the lines between perpetrator and victim blurred, and the social media commentary that had celebrated her triumph now shifted into a swirl of skepticism and debate. Daniel's cultural arguments only amplified the tension. From his perspective, certain actions carried moral weight tied to heritage and tradition, making the public spectacle feel not just personal but culturally loaded, adding layers of complexity to a story that had previously felt linear. The psychology behind secrecy is rarely simple. Many viewers immediately labeled Lisa's concealment as deception, a tactical maneuver to manipulate or control the narrative, but an alternate reading suggested fear, protection, and self-preservation. If public humiliation, courtroom exposure, and social judgment had already devastated reputations, could hiding parts of one's life actually be an instinctive defense rather than a calculated scam? The audience had to reconcile their instinctive judgments with the ambiguity of human behavior, weighing evidence against perception, trust against caution, and morality against survival. Every revelation prompted more questions than answers. Social media exploded with commentary. As clips of Lisa's confession circulated, hashtags multiplied and fan theories evolved by the minute. Viewers dissected motives. Some saw deliberate strategy, others empathy for a person navigating complex personal and cultural pressures. The tension escalated because the story was no longer about black and white villainy. It was about duality, contradictions, and the messy reality that no one is entirely innocent, yet few are entirely guilty. Daniel's claims that he had been misled, his emphasis on the cultural context, and his frustration over public judgment further complicated the audience's ability to assign blame. Trust had fractured on both sides, and the viewers were left in a liminal space where every moral compass seemed questioned. Behaviorally, this reversal illustrates a classic dynamic in high-stakes relationships. People often conceal information out of fear, shame, or perceived necessity. Even highly intelligent individuals miscalculate risk when emotions and stakes are intertwined. The audience, conditioned by weeks of drama, initially aligned with Lisa's victimhood, but the new revelations forced a reassessment. Could the very person who appeared wronged also be operating under her own agenda of self-preservation and control? As the tension mounted, it became clear that this story was no longer a straightforward narrative of betrayal and justice. Each secret, each hidden history, each cultural argument introduced ripple effects that changed perception and redefined allegiances. The psychological landscape was complex, emotionally charged, and far from resolved. Viewers were left grappling with fundamental questions about honesty, motive, and the fine line between concealment and deception. In the end, both sides had shadows in their past, both had motives that could be interpreted in multiple ways, and the neat dichotomy of villain versus victim collapsed under the weight of truth. The public had witnessed a reversal nobody expected, a twist that challenged instinct, judgment, and trust, leaving one lingering question: were both hiding something? And if so, how much of what they concealed shaped the story the world thought it understood? The moment the story expanded beyond personal betrayal into cultural scrutiny, the stakes shifted dramatically. Daniel's arguments about morality, faith, and heritage became front and center, challenging viewers to consider how deeply personal decisions intersect with public perception. In Nigeria, social norms and religious expectations carry weight, and when the king blessing controversy hit social media, reactions were explosive. Clips circulated showing the elaborate ceremony, dramatic proclamations, and intense scrutiny, while fans debated the authenticity of the moment. Was this a genuine appeal to tradition or a staged performance designed for maximum shock value? The truth was layered. As always, Daniel leaned on cultural symbolism to assert authority, while Lisa's response was scrutinized for compliance, resistance, or perceived manipulation. The psychology of shame is relentless when cultural norms are involved. Public humiliation amplifies private missteps, and when combined with social media, the effect is exponential. Millions of eyes on a person's actions can make even minor transgressions feel catastrophic. For viewers outside the cultural context, certain elements, rituals, ceremonies, formal pronouncements may feel theatrical or extreme, yet for insiders they carry layers of meaning and expectation. Understanding this dynamic is crucial because it demonstrates how behavior is judged differently depending on context. What looks staged might be sincere, and what seems honest might carry hidden agendas. Lisa's reactions, captured on camera, became just as scrutinized as Daniel's public performance. Every hesitation, every emotional response, every carefully timed comment was analyzed for intent. Was she genuinely shocked, defensive, or strategically calculating? Even intelligent viewers, previously confident in their assessment of victim and villain, found themselves doubting their conclusions. The story had entered a zone where behavior, secrecy, and cultural performance intersected in ways that made moral judgment increasingly difficult. Humor, though subtle, played an essential role in navigating this tension. Fans and commentators could laugh at the over-the-top theatrics, the excessive dramatics, or the social media frenzy, providing a psychological release from the intensity. A carefully placed joke about a ritual, a meme-worthy facial expression, or a sarcastic observation about the king's proclamations offered breathing room, allowing the audience to stay engaged without feeling overwhelmed. This balance of tension and levity is critical for retention because it keeps viewers emotionally invested without exhausting them, especially in segments where cultural context can feel heavy or confusing. Behind all of this, secrecy remained a powerful theme. Daniel's staged or strategic behaviors, Lisa's concealed history, and the way both parties presented themselves publicly created an environment where suspicion thrived. Every action was dissected, every statement questioned, and the viewers became detectives, trying to parse what was authentic and what was for show. Social media commentary escalated the tension, prompting debates about morality, honesty, and performance. As the narrative progressed, the king blessing moment became emblematic of the broader story, a blend of reality, perception, and performative behavior that left audiences questioning authenticity at every turn. If this ceremony with its pageantry and spectacle felt staged, then what other events, declarations, or displays were also carefully crafted for reaction? The line between truth and theater blurred, leaving one pressing question for viewers: in a world where secrecy, culture, and public scrutiny collide, how much of what they saw could really be trusted? The cameras never blinked, and neither did the viewers as some of the most eyebrow-raising moments hit the screen. The infamous bathroom incident circulated across social media like wildfire, clips looping endlessly while commentary exploded in every direction. On the surface, it was absurd, uncomfortable, and shocking, but behind the viral images lay a calculated strategy. Producers thrive on moments like these because they're magnets for engagement. Outrage drives clicks, debate fuels shares, and controversy keeps viewers glued to the timeline, refreshing and commenting while algorithms respond in real time. It's fascinating how quickly a single on-screen incident can hijack the narrative. Suddenly, discussions about money, betrayal, or romance take a back seat, and everyone's focus is on the spectacle. But there's a method to this madness. When producers spotlight public humiliation, tension spikes, viewers polarize, and social media explodes. Fans pick sides, memes are born, and engagement metrics soar. It's the reality TV equivalent of putting gasoline on a small spark. The small drama becomes massive, and everyone is compelled to react. Humor, subtle ridicule, or sarcastic commentary isn't just entertainment, it's a survival mechanism for the audience, a way to process discomfort without fully turning away. At the same time, these moments force us to question what we're witnessing. Are we watching genuine human interactions or carefully orchestrated performances designed to provoke response? When Daniel's gestures, Lisa's reactions, and the editing choices all sync to produce maximum shock, the line between reality and production manipulation becomes almost invisible. Viewers are drawn into the drama, invested in the emotional highs and lows, but part of the brain knows there's a lens shaping everything. This duality, empathy for the participants versus awareness of the performance, creates a constant tension that keeps people watching longer than they might otherwise. The psychology behind this engagement is subtle but effective. Humans are hardwired to respond to social conflict, embarrassment, and moral transgression. When someone appears to violate trust or social norms, curiosity kicks in. We want to see the consequences, analyze motives, and compare our own behavior to theirs. That's why even the most cringe-worthy or ridiculous scenes hold attention. Producers amplify these reactions, knowing viewers will linger, comment, and share, effectively turning private moments into collective experiences that dominate feeds and conversation. But there's another layer to consider. Behind the memes, GIFs, and viral clips, there's an emotional thread that ties everything together. People empathize with perceived victims, judge perceived wrongdoers, and feel the suspense of every twist. We laugh, cringe, or gasp because the moments touch on trust, pride, and relationships we understand in our own lives. This tension between schadenfreude and empathy is what sustains retention, keeping viewers invested even as outrage peaks and humor interject. Ultimately, it leaves one lingering question for the audience. Are we witnessing love unfolding under pressure? Or are we watching a performance crafted to generate reactions, clicks, and debate? The answer may be both, and that duality is what keeps eyes glued to the screen, hearts racing, and fingers typing in comment sections around the world. Every reaction, every share, every viral clip feeds back into the cycle, ensuring that the drama doesn't just live in the episode but continues to thrive long after the cameras stop rolling. By the time the dust seemed to settle, the conversation online had shifted. Initially, Daniel was painted as the ultimate schemer, the man who promised empires, secured $600,000, and then vanished behind a veil of secrets. Headlines screamed betrayal, social media posts condemned greed, and public sentiment rallied around Lisa. But as more details surfaced, cracks appeared in the simple hero-villain narrative. Lisa's own past, her concealed marriages, and questions about honesty introduced a moral complexity few were prepared for. Suddenly, the audience had to ask themselves, was this a straightforward scam or something far messier? If we step back and analyze the behaviors rather than the people, a pattern emerges. Daniel's actions, promises of wealth, staged appearances, and secretive relationships speak to a desire for power and validation. Yet, many intelligent individuals drawn by the fantasy of status can overlook warning signs when hope and intimacy intertwine with money. On the flip side, Lisa's concealments, hidden marriages, selective truths aren't necessarily malicious, but they complicate the emotional landscape. When fame and cameras enter the equation, every omission, every secret becomes amplified. And even small misjudgments are perceived as manipulation. This is where the intellectual sparring gets interesting. Were both guilty of different kinds of deception, or was the real culprit the environment itself? Fame magnifies behavior. Pressure escalates secrets, and public exposure turns private trust issues into global debates. The court of public opinion doesn't see nuance, it thrives on extremes, labeling heroes and villains without patience for context. Daniel's financial missteps were visible, measurable, and provable, while Lisa's emotional omissions were interpretive, filtered through judgment, cultural expectation, and social scrutiny. The tension arises because both sides were operating under very different rules, yet both were held accountable in ways that blurred morality with spectacle. Another layer complicates judgment. People watching from afar rarely see the incremental steps that led to the fallout, the subtle persuasion, the urgency, the intimate trust that enabled financial decisions. Daniel's promises may have seemed grandiose, but they were paired with emotional intimacy that made ignoring red flags almost inevitable. Similarly, Lisa's secrecy created space for misinterpretation, feeding suspicion even when no direct harm was intended. The dynamic illustrates a universal truth. Relationships under pressure expose not just deceit, but vulnerabilities, desires, and blind spots in everyone involved. When we question the narrative, the real villain may not be a single person. Blind trust, amplified by public scrutiny, has the power to distort perception, magnify mistakes, and create a cycle where everyone feels deceived. Daniel and Lisa become characters in a story shaped as much by cameras and commentary as by their choices. The narrative forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about accountability, expectation, and how easily behavior can be reframed once fame and fortune enter the picture. And just when you think the lines between who misled whom are drawn, a final revelation appears, forcing us to reconsider everything we thought we knew. What if the twist redefines not just the actions of Daniel and Lisa, but the very way we interpret trust, ambition, and exposure in relationships watched by the world? Everything comes full circle when we step back and look at the chaos as more than a series of betrayals and scandals. Daniel's empire promises, the $600,000 verdict, Lisa's secrets, public humiliation, and courtroom drama weren't just shocking headlines, they were lessons about how fragile trust can be when ambition, desire, and fame collide. Relationships are complicated on their own, but throw in money, cameras, and public expectation, and every decision, every omission, every misstep is amplified. The audience has witnessed how quickly admiration can turn into suspicion, hope into anger, and love into performance. The real takeaway isn't about labeling Daniel a villain or Lisa a hero, it's about understanding behavior under pressure. Trust isn't a guarantee, it's earned, tested, and sometimes shattered when stakes are high. Money and status can distort judgment, tempting even intelligent people to prioritize fantasy over fact. Fame transforms private heartbreak into global spectacle, and public exposure magnifies every flaw. Watching the story unfold teaches us to question not just others' intentions, but also how much we project our own desires onto people we barely know. And yet, there's empathy to be found in this chaos. Both Daniel and Lisa made choices shaped by fear, hope, ambition, and love. Both hid things, both miscalculated, and both became symbols for much bigger ideas than themselves. The audience learns that judgment alone misses nuance. Seeing behavior in context offers insight. Why did Lisa ignore red flags? Why did Daniel present illusions? Why did the public pick sides so quickly? Each question highlights human tendencies under pressure, reminding viewers that what looks like malice from afar often involves layers of complexity, insecurity, and circumstance. As the dust settles, one thing becomes clear. Trust, money, and fame are forces that can make even ordinary relationships feel like high-stakes drama. But they also create opportunity. Opportunity for self-awareness, caution, and reflection on what we value in others. The story leaves a mirror up to the audience. How do we navigate our own relationships under pressure, and how much are we willing to question the stories we're told? The saga doesn't end with a courtroom verdict or a viral social media post. It continues in the decisions we make and the judgments we carry. And just when you think the final lesson has been learned, another storm is quietly brewing. Within the 90-day universe, new partnerships, new betrayals, and new secrets are waiting, ready to challenge assumptions, ignite outrage, and redefine what we think we know about love and trust on reality television. If you thought you understood who misled whom, the next saga promises twists that will force viewers to reconsider everything again and again. The takeaway is emotional, cautionary, and unforgettable. Trust cautiously, question motives, and remember that fame magnifies every flaw and every choice. Because in this world, nothing is ever quite as it seemed. And the next 90-day twist could change the story entirely.